Welcome back to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm Vanessa Pozos, and here with me is Omar Pozos, my co-host and husband. And I just realized as you hit record that we are matching.
Are we? Oh, our aloe gear of aloe. Shout out to aloe. They want to sponsor us.
We're so cute in our matching sweatshirts.
How are you doing this morning?
I'm a little cold since we just came from plunging and just kind of rocking and rolling this morning. But I'm also excited because we're going to be traveling a little bit, getting some good work traveling, getting to connect with some people, and also going to a wedding, which is exciting. Yeah,
I like weddings, especially if they're in a good place like Mexico. So
cannot complain about that.
Excited for that as well.
Yeah. Well, on today's episode, I wanted to talk about a topic that I've been thinking about recently. And, it's funny because I was thinking about how, obviously, this past cycle of mine was a little bit more, I would say, symptomatic than I've had in many cycles. And one of the things that I noticed was increased this cycle was cravings. And I was thinking about that. And I also was thinking about how, when it comes to cravings, it's so normal, and you might not be like, oh yeah, I have these conversations all the time because it's more of a women thing. But I feel like
I'm just laughing over here in my head. I'm like, oh yeah, my cycle.
But it's very, very normal for women, during pregnancies or when you have friends who are pregnant to talk about the weird cravings you have during a pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And that's just a normal accepted part of yeah, of course, during pregnancies, all kinds of cravings and aversions and all the things, right? And so it makes sense. Your body's going through a lot of hormonal changes, a lot of shifts, a lot of chemical shifts. Of course you're going to have all these weird cravings, but yet outside of pregnancy we don't really tie cravings back to what it could be meaning is going on in your body. We tend to just look at cravings as oh man, I just really want this thing and I just don't have willpower, and what's wrong with me? Why do I crave this food? I'm addicted to this food. We tend to judge our cravings as more of a mental issue when it really it may not be an issue at all, for one, but two, it could more so be a signal from your body that there's a hormonal shift happening. Maybe there's a hormonal imbalance, or your body is just, seeking out something for a specific reason.
It sounds like it's almost like a dashboard on a car, right? When it's the wiper or the windshield wiper fluid is out, or, you need more air in your tires, and it kind of gives you different, warning signs, I guess you can call it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, your body's just,
you're yeah, sure.
Your body is constantly sending you signals. And we talk about this all the time. Symptoms are signals. Your symptoms are a way for your body to communicate with you. Mm. And I think people just forget that cravings are also oftentimes symptoms. And I of course, I want to say as well, cravings could also at times mean absolutely nothing other than maybe it's just you really like that food and maybe it's on your mind. Maybe you saw it. Maybe you haven't had it in a while. It could completely be more mental and emotional, more circumstantial, of course, as well. But I think we more often point to it being mental, emotional, circumstantial when we're not actually realizing that maybe we need to take a step back and ask our body, is it trying to communicate something to me right now? Is there this recurring craving I'm having, or it's happening at a certain time and I can trace back to maybe there's something actually going on and I need to, rather than just appease the craving or resist the craving and just focus on the craving itself, maybe I need to just see the craving as a signal, as a symptom, and get to the root cause of the craving, fix the root cause, and then I may not experience those cravings anymore.
What kind of cravings were you having in this past menstrual cycle that you had?
Sugar cravings, and I always chocolate is always my weakness in general, but those are two on my list that we're going to talk about here.
All right, let's dive into it.
Yeah. So, and I do, again, I want to kind of emphasize here of when I talk through how, these very common types of cravings, how they can point back to certain things in the body. Many of these explanations are not necessarily reasons for us to be oh, now I'm having this craving. It could be this thing. Oh, well, now the craving is, justified. I should have the craving. It's more of oh, this craving is pointing back potentially to a certain thing. If other things align that could be going on in my body, then maybe I should be addressing that root cause. And, the craving in and of itself, that's up to you in terms of addressing the relationship with food side of, do we need to work on our mental and emotional aspects of food? Do we need to appease the craving and have these foods? Or maybe would it be better for us to not have those specific foods in certain instances?
Did you feel the need to share that because of the way I interpret things at times? Because I'm like, oh yeah, I'm like, my body just needs it, so therefore I'm gonna give in.
Yeah,
I didn't know where you were going with that.
No, that was not pointed at you, but that is something that's funny that I feel like you'll do. Like, oh I need this for this reason. I'm like, you're just making up reasons. But no, I think I more so want to like preface this episode as being of like, these are not reasons necessarily for us to like justify having the thing, but these also are not reasons for us to like not have the thing either and tell us like, oh, I can't have that. It's really just this issue. That's a whole nother topic to go down of like whether or not we are having the things that we're craving, because there's a lot of nuance to that. I think there's a lot of context required around that. But ultimately, what I do want you, the listener, to be thinking about as you're thinking through these things, if you experience these cravings, maybe you are currently experiencing these cravings, I want you simply to be kinder to yourself when you potentially struggle with these cravings, when these cravings pop up. I don't want you to jump to judging yourself as, I just don't have enough, willpower or self-control, or like, gosh, I'm addicted to these, I'm addicted to sugar, I'm addicted to salt, I just always want these things. It might not be a you issue. I want you truly just to be kinder to yourself, kinder to your body, and maybe thank your body for sending you that signal, because ultimately there might be a greater purpose behind it. But let's go ahead and dive in, and let's see if we can really start to understand our cravings a little bit more and maybe tie them back to what might be going on in our bodies. So, number one, the first common craving that I want to address here is salt cravings. Salt cravings, that's a big one. I personally, I had a lot of salt cravings back a few years ago. And I'm going to explain why here, because a very, very common one that drives salt cravings is low cortisol, or, what might also be commonly referred to as adrenal fatigue, HPA axis dysfunction. Essentially, when our adrenals have been really working hard, pushing out high amounts of cortisol for an extended period of time. And eventually that leads to kind of this like overcorrection to where now we are usually with low cortisol. And so when your adrenals have been taxed out because they've been producing a lot of cortisol, and adrenals produce a lot of hormones. Adrenals are responsible for a lot of hormonal production across the board, but a very, very important one being cortisol, our stress hormone. So if we have been under a lot of stress, mental stress, emotional stress, maybe traumas, whatever it is, it could be physical stressors, like we've been working out hard, we've been dieting. There's a lot of aspects to the stress. Well, our adrenals use a lot of minerals, use a lot of sodium especially. And so what tends to happen is these like sodium stores and just mineral stores in general tend to get depleted because your adrenals have just been like pumping out the cortisol. They've been working hard, right? And so now your stores have been depleted. And so what's going to happen? Your body's like, we need more sodium. So now you're getting all these cravings for salty foods.
So a bit of a response mechanism kind of thing?
Yeah. It's ultimately your body is wanting you to get more of that sodium in because your adrenals are already taxed, you're already, low cortisol. It needs more of that to kind of keep powering. It's kind of like, okay, we got to throw more coal in the fire right now. And so what's it going to do? It's going to have you reach for like the saltiest foods it can. Suddenly now you're, really wanting the salty French fries. You're really craving the Chinese food, like, however that shows up for you, you probably are wanting a lot of very salty things at that point. But the reality is you don't really need the like sodium filled, Chinese food or things like that. What you probably need is having a just good whole foods diet and adding in a good, a quality salt. Like we personally use, Redmond's real salt. And so like we, cook majority of our meals, we put Redmond's real salt on our cooked food. And then we'll also add electrolytes into our day. And during that time when I was recovering from adrenal fatigue, I was actually taking multiple electrolyte packets across the day because I needed to restore so much. And so I think people don't really quite understand that. Another reason you could be experiencing salt cravings might be where you're at in your cycle. So you could be in your luteal phase. So think second half of your cycle, post ovulation, before your period. And it's super, super common. Like I just mentioned earlier, I was experiencing a little bit more heightened cravings in this past cycle. And I wouldn't say I was necessarily craving salt here, but for a lot of women, you might notice salt cravings picking up in your luteal phase. And a big reason for that is because aldosterone. So aldosterone is a hormone we don't talk about too often because it's not like that exciting of a hormone, but aldosterone's role essentially is actually your sodium regulation in your body. Its role is to kind of regulate the balance of sodium and water. So aldosterone directly is what's kind of like causing a lot of salt cravings when we're experiencing these kind of cravings, because it's what's making sure we're getting enough sodium. So with that, aldosterone, it tends to follow progesterone in ways. So during your luteal phase, as progesterone kind of starts to go up, aldosterone will follow. That's where it's very, very normal for us to just look a little bit more puffy, kind of hold more water, and just be puffier across the board in our luteal phase. It's like a very normal thing that just like is part of biology in the woman's body. However, if we are also low estrogen, it's very, very common for this to be like even heightened, because estrogen, like without getting too in the science of it, estrogen's a little bit more on like the flip side with aldosterone. So when estrogen is low, aldosterone's going to be a little bit higher there. And so that's where, especially I see for women heading more into perimenopause, estrogen lowering, they're probably going to be a little bit puffier across the board because of that relationship.
Aldosterone is getting higher kind of thing?
Yeah. Essentially, if like estrogen's going to be more lower, they're probably going to have higher aldosterone at that point.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's basically, again, it's like these shifts in our body that we can just start to notice of, especially maybe, let's say you're in your 40s, maybe even 30s, because I see this more and more of women in their 30s experiencing perimenopausal hormonal shifts. But if, let's say, you're noticing all the time, you're just a little bit more puffy, you have a lot of salt cravings, I would really encourage you, think about how has your stress been? Like, could it be a cortisol issue? Could you be, maybe heading down the path or currently in adrenal fatigue? We've done episodes around those things. You can kind of go and listen to that and see if you relate to any of those other symptoms. If not, I would look at our sex hormones here and consider, maybe is estrogen low? What has your cycle been like? Is your cycle changing? Is it now getting like longer, shorter? Has your bleed been changing? Like, notice a lot of these different things, because these can all be signals that tie back to it. And it just helps you, again, be softer and more understanding to yourself, because you're not like, gosh, I already feel bad in my body, and here now I just can't control myself around the French fries. It might be a biological response happening in your body right now that's causing you to specifically crave that salt, because your body is seeking out more sodium.
Yeah. To your point of like looking puffier too, because I know a lot of times, a lot of the women that we chat with that have, adrenal fatigue or, have just been dealing with a lot of high cortisol, and they're still doing like high intense workouts, and they're just really, really pushing their body. And they're like, I don't understand. I'm doing everything right, and I'm getting puffier and more inflamed. That explains a lot of it too, which is pretty cool, just to be able to see the ins and outs of it.
Yeah, that's an aldosterone thing as well. With the high intensity exercise, that typically will be kind of a response there to where that's where a lot of women will hold water. That's a big one that I notice for myself. If I've been pushing too hard in training, I start to look puffier. And it's like the most frustrating thing, because here
you should be the opposite.
Yeah, it's right? Like you think, oh man, I'm gonna work harder. I want to get in, I'm going to push myself, and that's going to make me look fitter and feel fitter. And then suddenly you look puffier, you're more bloated. It's like, what the heck? That's so discouraging. If anybody else relates to that, I'm right there with you, because that's how my body operates. If I kind of cross that line of pushing too hard, doing too much, doing too high of intensity, I just get puffy and bloated, and it's the worst. But those are some reasons why you might be experiencing salt cravings. I do want to note as well, not necessarily like a hormonal response, but it could also be a low blood pressure issue as well. When sodium levels in the blood drops, the body does signal a need for more of that salt through cravings, obviously, because it does ultimately need to restore the sodium balance and increase blood volume. And that's how it kind of gets blood pressure back to that normal level. So if this is something where it's like happening all the time, you've kind of, thought, okay, I feel like adrenals are fine, I feel like sex hormones are fine, maybe take a look at blood pressure. And hopefully that's something that, you go to the doctor, once a year, get a physical, get that checked out. And hopefully that's something you can be catching as well.
That's the one that I would probably blame. I'd be like, oh yeah, salt cravings, my blood pressure, babe. I just got to eat more.
Yeah, exactly. Now, number 2 in terms of my list of like common cravings, and we're going to dive into why these cravings might be coming up. This is one that I mentioned earlier that I personally experience quite a bit, and this is sugar cravings. We could also just address this as like carb cravings across the board, because it doesn't necessarily have to always show up as sugar cravings, but it's basically you're craving some form of very simple carbohydrates, because what is happening here is these cravings is your body seeking out a very simple, easy to digest form of glucose, essentially. So what are some reasons this could be happening? Super common one would be insulin resistance. So we've talked about insulin resistance on the podcast. We have a whole episode dedicated to it, but we have talked about this many times. But ultimately, this is when your body is no longer effectively processing glucose. Your body is at a point to where you're going to have big swings in your blood sugar because, insulin, I always like to use the analogy that insulin's like the little taxi that carries your glucose, the blood sugar, to where it needs to go. Well, it's kind of like roads are getting blocked off. Those insulin is not really getting to the cell where it needs to go. And ultimately, your body's just not processing it very well. So what tends to happen in that situation is now you have a lot of just like big swings in your blood sugar. You want to keep your blood sugar very like stable without having like big highs and lows. Well, now you're going to have big highs and lows. And so when you have those lows, you're going to have very intense sugar cravings. And it's just very, very common to be craving sugar or just like breads, cereals, like very easy to digest, very like simple, basic carbohydrates. Another reason you could be experiencing sugar cravings is, there could be some hormonal, like sex hormone type of things happening here. So post-ovulation, so again, we're kind of looking more at luteal phase, but, really after ovulation, typically we'll experience a drop in our serotonin levels. And let's think about it. These types of mood changes often have us seeking out that quick, simple energy as well, because when we have things that are like sugar that are quick to digest, that can kind of give you that little like hit of feel good feelings. So when we are a little bit lower serotonin, very, very common as well to be craving sugars and things like that. It's very common as well in like more of the later luteal phase when you have that drop in all hormones. You're basically just low hormone right before your period and on your period. Energy is lower. Guess what? Energy is lower. Your body's smart. It's going to be like, we need some more like quick, easy energy. What's the quickest, easiest energy sources? Sugar. Yeah, exactly. So that could be like a multitude of reasons that happens, but those are less of like problems and more of, again, just kind of understanding the shifts that happen in your body across your cycle and how that could be driving different cravings and helping you understand like, oh, maybe I'm craving this sugary food, but it's not that I actually need the food. It's more that I just need, a good source of carbohydrates. Maybe I need a good walk, like it's more kind of giving you an opportunity to ask yourself what is actually best for me here, not just like, what am I seeking out?
Yeah. Or even in this case, I mean, like, okay, instead of just giving it, sugar and giving it more spikes and drops and stuff, can we just learn how to eat a more balanced diet to be able to, manage your sugar levels a little bit? And that's honestly, that's something that I'm working on myself. So absolutely.
Yeah. It's like going back to the insulin resistance thing. It really is like it's such a hard place to get out of, because when you're experiencing all these cravings, what happens? Like you're craving the foods, but the foods are driving the issue. So you're stuck in this cycle of like the foods you're eating, the way you're balancing your meals, the way that you're eating, all these things can be driving these kind of roller coaster of blood sugars, but the roller coaster is making you want more of that. And so you kind of continue to stay stuck there.
Yeah. And especially because after you eat dinner, I'm like, now I want something sweet, or you know what I mean? And you're right, it does kind of continue to feed it.
Yeah, it very much is one of those things where it's like, that's where if we want to break out of that, we do have to kind of go through a period that might feel a little bit more restrictive, might feel a little bit more challenging, because we do have to just ultimately resist that kind of chemical response in our body of our body seeking out the blood sugar, knowing mentally, I don't actually need that right now. It's a response that's happening because of, the way my body has been operating up to this point. I no longer want my body to operate that way. So I need to break that cycle and, kind of work through those cravings. Some other reasons why you could be having some sugar cravings or just kind of carb cravings across the board is, again, coming back to cortisol. So oftentimes, this might be especially more like an acute kind of response. So if we're having a, increase in cortisol after maybe a stressful experience, maybe you had a hard day and, you're like, God, today was just crazy. You get home and what happens? Maybe now suddenly you find yourself in the pantry just like wanting to eat all the sugar, right? That's a very, very common thing, because that high cortisol just dump is now going to prompt your body to be like, oh, we need more quick energy here. And so what's your body going to do? Seek out the quick energy from sugar. And then it also, not necessarily like a hormonal response, but it could also be a nutrient deficiency thing as well. Low magnesium, low chromium, some of these different like mineral stores that can also lead to some sugar cravings as well. So again, it's one of those where it comes back to sometimes we have to address our food quality so that we can stop craving the foods that might not be serving us in that, amount that we're having. It's not to say we can't ever have those foods, but sometimes we need to, if we want to have less of them, we know that's going to serve ourselves well. We need to work on our overall kind of diet with that. Another thing that you might find yourself craving is fat craving. So think like fatty foods. It might be like, I don't really want the sugary thing right now. I want the really rich, more, and this could show up in a lot of different ways.
I'm trying to think what foods would show up or have you noticed any foods show up for you?
I've never been someone who really experienced a lot of fat cravings. I would say maybe in my adrenal fatigue days, I feel like I just was craving all the things all the time.
Maybe like a burger? Would that be something fatty?
I mean, yeah, that could be an option. I'm more so thinking of you really want the rich cheese on your.
Oh, I see.
It's more of okay, I'm gonna already have this thing. I really want the cheese on it. I'm gonna have, this food. I really want the greasy burger, not just the regular burger. I want it
the Five Guys greasy burger.
Yeah, it's when you just you kind of can think about it. Think of the difference between a food that maybe it's the same food, but one that's a little bit more of a fatty version. You're I want the fatty version right now.
If you're having, I don't know, pancakes and you're I just want extra butter and all the toppings and stuff.
Yeah, it might be something where normally you're man, I really want the maple syrup.
Now I want pancakes. So let's keep going.
Yeah, sorry everybody. I'm just creating all the cravings. But again, that's what we were talking about in the beginning. Sometimes it's just circumstantial. We might be talking about a food. Now it's top of mind. Now you're oh man, I'm really craving this. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have something deeper going on. Well, I'm also
getting lab work today, so I haven't eaten yet. So that's why.
Yeah, I feel that. So fat cravings. What could be some reasons that we're experiencing these? Well, it could just be low hormone across the board. So if you, I see this oftentimes in people's labs that they're just everything is kind of bottomed out. Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, this might be, post-birth control syndrome. There could be a lot of things going on here. But if you think about it, so pretty much all of our hormones descend from either cholesterol or from our adrenal glands. And so we've talked a bit about adrenal fatigue, adrenals being taxed, low cortisol, and how that can affect hormones and how that can lead to several different types of cravings. So that here could also lead a little bit to some fat cravings as well. But oftentimes, if your body is really struggling to produce hormones, it might also be seeking out, we need a little bit more of that cholesterol. So it might lead you to seeking out more of that fat as well. That's absolutely something that could be happening there. It could also be a deficiency, a nutrient deficiency. So you could be deficient in omega-3s or omega-6. It's if you are just deficient in omega-3, because that's really more of our anti-inflammatory omega there. So that's really going to affect things down the chain, because if you're deficient in omega-3, you're going to be very inflamed across the board. And if you're really inflamed, that's going to affect your body's ability to produce hormones. I like to think of it as an analogy of, remember, hormones in and of themselves, they're chemical messengers. Hormones are messages being sent across the body. If your body's having trouble producing those messages or receiving those messages, having those messages be effective in what they're supposed to be doing, almost think of it as there's probably some inflammation going on that's the signal is getting fuzzy. So that's kind of how I like to think about it. But, think if you have a really crappy cell service and you're I'm traveling and I'm trying to send out these text messages and they just are not going through, or they're going through delayed. Yeah, that's kind of what's happening in the body when you have a lot of inflammation built up.
That's the worst feeling in the world.
I think there's probably worse feelings in the world than that.
What is it? It's first world problems or whatever.
Yeah.
I have no cell service.
Yeah. So those are a couple reasons that fat cravings could be happening here. Caffeine cravings is another one I commonly hear, and this is one that I've definitely dealt with quite a bit in the past. This could also literally just be that you've built up a high tolerance to caffeine, and so your body really needs it in high amounts in order to kind of get the same stimulus that maybe you had when you first started drinking caffeine. But let's talk about on that deeper reason, why might your body be seeking out caffeine, right? Well, caffeine really does mimic cortisol, essentially. So if we are low cortisol, if we are more in that adrenal fatigue state, that might be something that your body starts to reach for, because it's here we are, just at this point, we're struggling. We're struggling to create cortisol. Our adrenals are taxed. Things aren't going well. It's we need something to bring some energy in. So that's where you typically might be craving more coffee, especially more like sweetened coffees, because what did we talk about earlier? Your body's probably also, your body's probably also seeking out sugar and some of that kind of quick form of energy as well.
Yeah. So do you think that they very much could be related when there is like cortisol, or adrenal fatigue and stuff like that? And all of a sudden it's like the combination of the sugary plus the coffee and a combination of both of those?
Yeah. Well, I noticed for myself, even like when I'm in a more high stress period, I'm like, I don't even really care about food right now. I just want like a good sweet iced coffee. Like,
say you're the problem. I've been obsessed with coffees lately. So.
I'm the problem. Okay.
It's your hormones, Vanessa, that are impacting us both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that maybe we need to do an episode on personal responsibility. That could be
Didn't we do one last week or 2 weeks ago?
If we did, go back and listen to that one, babe.
The pep talk. You can do hard things.
Yep. Yeah, no, but realistically, it's like I say this because I get it. I've been there in the shoes of like really feeling like you need caffeine and like feeling like, oh my gosh, maybe you recognize that in order to heal my body, if we're in an adrenal fatigue state, we're gonna have to cut out caffeine for a period of time, because caffeine is like, imagine like your adrenal gland is this sponge and you were able to like squeeze it and, water was coming out. And then like in this analogy, the water would be like the cortisol coming out effectively, but you got to a point where you haven't let the sponge kind of fill up between squeezes again. And you've just been squeezing. Now it's dried out. Nothing can come out anymore. That's kind of what's happening with your adrenal gland. Now, if we throw caffeine into the mix, caffeine is just like squeezing the adrenal glands even more. And so you're just like continuously putting a lot of stress and strain on the adrenals, not giving them a chance to actually recover. And that's where that kind of term adrenal fatigue comes from. It's not that your adrenals actually become fatigued. Like that's not actually biologically the way that works, but that's a way to kind of understand what is happening there. So if we just kind of medicate by giving ourselves more caffeine, you're going to end up worse and worse and worse over time. You're going to get to a point where caffeine doesn't even do anything for you anymore. And I say that from experience. Another reason you might be craving caffeine, though, could be insulin resistance. So again, this is another one that has like a common thread with cravings. If we are dealing with insulin resistance, again, now your blood sugars are probably on a little bit of a roller coaster. You're probably experiencing some of those blood sugar dips and highs, a little bit more of the sugar cravings and things like that. But you also typically notice a lot of energy swings. And with those energy swings, you probably are then seeking out a little bit more of that caffeine to kind of help alleviate that. So that's another thing to look at, is where are your blood sugars if you're really relying on caffeine here. Last one on my list, and I saved probably my favorite for last because this is one that like I am a little bit of a chocoholic, and so this one is chocolate cravings. And so this is a perfect example of like, just because you love a food doesn't mean that like you have these intense cravings and there's something, going on, or like it's a biological reason, but there could be. And so let's talk about some reasons why you could be craving chocolate specifically. So a big one, and I think a lot of people have heard this before, but they don't really fully understand it. And that is the fact that chocolate is actually high in magnesium. So oftentimes, and not all the time, and again, I don't want to like justify people's cravings of like, oh, this is why. But I do want people to take a look at this, because magnesium deficiencies is extremely common. Most people are deficient in magnesium. Chocolate is a very palatable and accessible form of magnesium for the body. And so if you're someone who already likes chocolate, you might find that you're craving chocolate a little bit more intensely if maybe you need magnesium. And so magnesium is like, I call it like the miracle mineral. It's used in pretty much more, bodily processes than I think almost anything else.
Magnesium is really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
It is used in a ton of functions in the body. So that's why it can be so like make such a difference to maybe supplement with magnesium if we are deficient there. But honestly, most people could probably benefit from a magnesium supplementation. We could go down a whole rabbit hole with that, because not all, there's different types of magnesium with different purposes and all of that. But, if your body is deficient in magnesium, and this is a mineral that's used in so many processes, your body's going to seek it out in any way that it can. And so that's where you might end up with heightened chocolate cravings. That being said, doesn't necessarily mean go eat the chocolate to get your magnesium, because there are going to be better, even more, bioavailable and more potent sources of magnesium. Possibly just supplement. Magnesium could be a great supplement to add to your routine. And I don't recommend supplements very often, but that's one that most people could benefit from. Another reason you could be craving chocolate is being low progesterone or estrogen dominant. So that can lead to some low magnesium as well, especially in the luteal phase. If we kind of take a look at, one specific role of magnesium, so it's really important in overall kind of liver detoxification. It plays a pretty big role there in the ability to metabolize and detoxify, eliminate estrogen, essentially. So if our estrogen levels are getting high relative to progesterone, this is what we call estrogen dominance. The body might be then like having to work really, really hard to clear all this estrogen out. And so it might be using up a lot of those stores of magnesium. And so that could lead to your body then seeking out more of that magnesium, again, via chocolate. Could be its kind of source that it's looking for. Another reason could be low dopamine. So, chocolate definitely gives that dopamine boost. So that's been studied as well. And so if you are in more of a stress state, maybe your cortisol has been high. Again, we could use the kind of like story of, let's say you had a really hard day and, you're feeling pretty run down. It was pretty stressful. Well, maybe now you're seeking out chocolate, and that could be your body seeking out dopamine after such a more stressful day. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, so it's not necessarily a hormone here, but I wanted to bring it up anyway in the sense that it is one of those where if we are low in dopamine, we're going to have lower motivation, we're going to have lower focus, we're going to be more fatigued, we're just going to have like less drive overall. And so that's where you might be like in that place where you're like, I just don't want to do anything but eat chocolate. I've probably said that before, but.
Well, the only thing that I think of when I hear like chocolate, but it's like, the like scene in movies where like a girl gets broken up with and she's like, I need chocolate. And they just go and just like stuff themselves with chocolate. But I'm like, it kind of makes a little bit of sense though.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one I'll kind of add here as well. And again, not necessarily exactly a hormonal thing, but all of these really could relate back to hormones as well, because as we know, all these different processes in the body do relate back to each other. And so that could be that your body is maybe seeking out some nervous system support, or, seeking out some support for some inflammation in the body. And that's because cocoa specifically, so obviously an ingredient in chocolate, depending on, the type of chocolate. So this could even be more of like, if you're specifically seeking out more of like that rich, dark chocolate, higher percentage of cocoa in it, that is actually rich in two compounds that are beneficial for inflammation and for the nervous system. So flavonoids, that's a type of antioxidant that actually does help reduce inflammation, helps protect our brain cells from damage. And then the other compound is I don't know if I
was going to say this one fast 2 times. Ready?
We're just going to try and say it once correctly, and that's theobromine. And that's an alkaloid, and it stimulates the central nervous system and can increase energy levels and mental alertness. So while, it's probably less likely that, if I'm being honest, that your body is like specifically seeking out chocolate because it's like, we need the theobromine, we need the flavonoids. That's less likely. Is that what your body's
saying? I need that theobromine in me.
Yeah, that's less likely. But I still wanted to add this on the list because selfishly, I love chocolate, and so it kind of gives me a little bit of like, there's some benefits to chocolate here. We could go down that path. But anyway, I hope that this episode was informative, and I want the point of this to be like, I don't expect everyone to walk away from this and be like, oh, I remember exactly that salt cravings means this, which could be meaning that. I just want you to open your mind up to the fact that your cravings might not necessarily be that you're having like issues with food. It might be that there's something going on with your body, and your body is seeking out support via certain foods and certain nutrients that it is seeking. So give your body some love and some kindness, and maybe address some of the potential root issues rather than just kind of appeasing the craving and letting the craving continue on because we're not actually addressing the issue. So I hope that this was helpful. I hope this was interesting. If it was, share it with a friend and make sure you subscribe. We'll be back next week with another great episode.
Bye, everybody.